It was a bright and bustling morning at the airport, and Ava couldn't help but feel the flutter of excitement in her chest. She was on her way to visit her grandmother, who lived in another state, and she hadn't seen her in months. It was going to be a short but joyful trip. As she checked in for her flight, the process seemed smooth enough. After a brief wait, she was handed her boarding pass, showing her seat in the first-class section. Ava smiled to herself. It was her first time flying first class, a special treat for the occasion. Ava was proud of herself for getting such a good seat, especially since it was a last-minute booking. She had heard all the stories about the comfort and luxury of first class, and she couldn't wait to experience it. She quickly found her way through the terminal, her heart racing with excitement. As she walked towards the gate, she could already hear the boarding announcements echoing through the air. The moment Ava entered the plane, she was greeted by a friendly flight attendant who pointed her towards her seat. It was in the middle of the section, next to the window. The seats were plush, and the small extra space gave her a sense of luxury she'd never experienced before. She settled into her seat, stretching her legs out in the roomy space. It felt good to be somewhere so comfortable. But then, she noticed him. A man in his early 50s, wearing a neatly pressed suit, was walking down the aisle. He had a frown on his face as he looked around, his eyes scanning the rows of seats. Ava didn't think much of it at first, but when he stopped right in front of her, she felt her stomach twist slightly. The man was glaring down at her with a look of disgust. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little too loud for the quiet cabin. "That seat is mine." Ava blinked in confusion, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Sorry, I think this is my seat. See, my boarding pass says 2A. She pointed to the number on the overhead compartment above her seat. The man didn't seem to care about her explanation. His frown deepened. "No, you don't understand," he said, his voice now rising. "I'm sitting here, and I need you to move. This is first class." His tone was condescending and sharp. Ava sat there, frozen for a moment, not quite understanding what was happening. She had already checked her boarding pass twice, and everything seemed to be in order. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. The man shook his head, clearly irritated. He didn't seem to care much about Ava's words. "I don't think you understand," he said again, this time a little more forcefully. "I've paid a lot of money for this seat, and you don't belong here. You need to move." His voice had a harsh edge now, and his eyes were scanning her as though trying to find something about her that didn't belong. Ava could feel the heat rising in her chest, her face growing warm with embarrassment. She looked around at the other passengers. Some were watching, some were pretending not to notice, but none of them stepped in to help. The flight attendant, Sophie, had been busy checking the safety features of the plane, but when she saw the commotion, she hurried over. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, trying to defuse the tension. Ava quickly explained the situation. "This is my seat. I have my boarding pass right here." Sophie nodded, her tone calm but firm. "Let's check the seat map and see if there's any confusion." As Sophie began to check, the man's frustration only seemed to increase. He began pacing back and forth in the aisle, muttering to himself about people who don't know their place. Ava could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't used to confrontation, especially not like this. She had never had anyone speak to her this way before, and it made her feel small and powerless. Mr. Thompson, the man, kept talking to himself loudly. He was going on about how this seat was meant for people who actually matter, and this whole thing is ridiculous. His voice was a mix of anger and confusion, and it was only growing louder. Ava wished she could disappear into the seat and pretend like none of this was happening. She didn't want to cause any trouble, but she also knew she couldn't just let him walk all over her. "I've paid a premium for this," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice rising even more. And I'm not going to sit next to someone like you. This is ridiculous. Sophie looked between Ava and Mr. Thompson. Sir, the seat is assigned to her. There's no mistake. She's in the correct seat. If you'd like, I can assist you in finding another seat. The man, though, was not having it. He looked at Sophie with a glare that could freeze someone in place. No, I want her moved. Now. His voice was cold and demanding. He didn't care about the inconvenience or the discomfort it caused. All he cared about was getting his way. Sophie looked apologetic but stood her ground. Sir, there are no other seats in first class. This is the seat assigned to her, and I cannot ask her to move. Ava's heart was racing now. She wanted to speak up, but she didn't want to escalate the situation further. She had already felt the tension in the air, and part of her wanted to retreat into silence, but something inside her refused to just let this man push her around. She had the right to sit in that seat, and she wasn't going to back down. Mr. Thompson's face was red now, his patience clearly worn thin. I'll have you fired for this, he barked at Sophie. You'll regret this. The flight attendants had been trained for these situations, but Ava could tell this wasn't something that happened every day. Sophie had a calmness in her voice, but there was an edge to it now. I'm sorry, sir, but you'll need to either take a seat or be escorted off the plane. This behavior is not acceptable. Ava looked down at her lap, trying to steady her breathing. The situation was escalating faster than she could have imagined. The flight had barely started, and already she was in the middle of something she never thought she'd experience. She wasn't just a passenger on a plane anymore. She was standing up for herself, and she wasn't going to let anyone tell her she didn't belong. The tension in the air was thick, like you could almost feel it wrapping around the cabin. Ava, still sitting in her seat, felt her hands getting clammy as she gripped the armrests. Her mind was racing, but she stayed quiet, trying to make sense of the situation. The flight attendant, Sophie, was doing her best to calm Mr. Thompson down, but it was clear that he wasn't listening to reason. Sir, I understand that you are frustrated, Sophie said, her voice steady and professional. But we've already checked the seating arrangement. This is her seat, and there are no other available first-class seats at the moment. Please, let's just calm down. Mr. Thompson was pacing again, muttering angrily to himself, his face growing redder with every passing second. Ava had never seen someone so worked up over something so small. She tried to shrink into her seat, hoping the situation would just go away, but it wasn't that simple. She could feel his eyes on her, and they weren't the kind of eyes that made her feel seen. They felt like they were judging her, trying to make her feel out of place. She was starting to get that sick feeling in her stomach, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Mr. Thompson stopped in front of Sophie, his chest heaving as he glared at her. This is unacceptable, he barked. I've paid for this premium experience, and I'm not going to sit next to some person like her. He pointed his finger directly at Ava, his voice shaking with anger. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She could feel her face burning with embarrassment, but at the same time, a rush of frustration was building inside her. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't going to let him push her around just because he thought he was entitled to something. She had the right to be here just as much as he did, and she was going to stand her ground. Sophie tried again, this time softer but firm. Sir, please take a seat. We don't want any further issues. We can resolve this calmly. But Mr. Thompson wasn't interested in calming down. Instead, he was getting louder, more insistent. I'm not moving from here until she moves. You're all making a huge mistake. I should never have to sit next to someone like her. Get her out of my way. Ava could feel her breath coming faster now, the words cutting into her like ice. She wanted to say something, to fight back, but her mind was still trying to process the absurdity of it all. Why was he acting this way? Why was he so fixated on something that didn't matter? Her seat was hers, just like everyone else's seat was theirs. The other passengers were starting to notice the scene. Some were watching from the corners of their eyes, others trying to ignore it, but the whispers were starting to ripple through the cabin. Ava could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she refused to look around. She didn't want to make it worse by acknowledging them. She focused on Sophie, trying to get a sense of what was happening. "I'm going to have to call for additional help," Sophie said, her voice more firm now. "This behavior is unacceptable, and I'll have to involve the captain if necessary." Mr. Thompson scoffed. "The captain? Are you seriously threatening to involve the captain over something this trivial?" He shook his head in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Ava watched as Sophie stepped away to communicate with the crew. Sophie's calm demeanor gave Ava a little comfort. The flight attendants were trained for situations like this, and she trusted that Sophie would find a way to handle it. But Ava's mind was still swirling. What was happening here? How had something as simple as sitting in her assigned seat turned into this? A few minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. The flight was scheduled to take off soon, and people were beginning to settle in, buckling their seatbelts. Yet, the tension in the air wasn't going away. It was thick, suffocating almost. Ava just wanted to be left alone. She didn't want to cause any trouble. She just wanted to enjoy her flight, to relax, and to get to her grandmother's house. But that wasn't going to happen, not until Mr. Thompson either calmed down or was removed. Ava tried to take deep breaths, but the more she thought about what was happening, the harder it became to focus. She wasn't used to confrontations like this. Back home, she'd dealt with her share of prejudice and unfair treatment, but this was different. This was happening in a place where people were supposed to feel safe. Suddenly, the voice of the captain came over the intercom, startling everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready for takeoff, but it seems we have a situation that needs to be resolved. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants will be coming around shortly to make sure everything is in order." Ava heard the captain's voice, but it didn't bring her the comfort it was meant to. She knew the flight attendants were about to get involved in a much bigger way, and part of her was worried about what would happen next. That's when she saw him. At the back of the plane, a man stood up. He was tall, with a presence that immediately caught everyone's attention. He wasn't wearing a suit like Mr. Thompson. Instead, he was dressed in a simple black jacket, his hair short and neatly combed. But what really caught Ava's eye was the calm, confident way he carried himself. He didn't look like someone who would be involved in a confrontation. He looked like someone who could handle himself in any situation, no matter how intense. He started walking toward the commotion, his gaze never leaving Mr. Thompson. As he moved closer, Ava saw a small glint of metal at his side, tucked under his jacket. A badge. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he? Before she could finish her thought, the man reached Mr. Thompson, who was still fuming in front of Sophie. Without saying a word, the man slowly lifted his jacket and revealed a badge, an FBI badge. Mr. Thompson froze. His face drained of color as he realized who he was facing. The moment Mr. Thompson saw the badge, his entire demeanor shifted. It was as though a sudden wave of shock had washed over him. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For a second, it seemed like time had stopped, and the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The man in the black jacket, standing tall and confident, didn't move or speak right away. His presence was calm but commanding. He simply looked down at Mr. Thompson, letting the weight of the moment settle. Ava, still in her seat, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief flood over her. This man, whoever he was, had just created a shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to disappear, replaced by a quiet, almost respectful silence. Mr. Thompson, still staring at the badge, looked like he was trying to make sense of what was happening. His eyes darted from the badge to the man's face and then back to the badge again, as though hoping the image would change. But it didn't. The FBI agent's badge gleamed in the light, a symbol of authority that was undeniable. "Is there something you need to say, sir?" the agent asked in a calm, measured voice. His tone wasn't threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of voice that made it clear this wasn't a conversation, but a statement. Mr. Thompson blinked, still frozen, and then he stumbled backward slightly. His voice came out in a stammer, I don't. This is all a misunderstanding." "I didn't know." The agent didn't let him finish. He stepped forward, his gaze unflinching. "There's no misunderstanding," he said. "You've been harassing this young woman, demanding her seat simply because of who she is. That's not something we tolerate. Not on this plane, and certainly not in this country." Ava couldn't believe what she was hearing. This man wasn't just protecting her, he was standing up for what was right, for the principle of fairness and respect. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't yelling or threatening. He was simply stating facts, and the calmness in his words made them even more powerful. "Sir," the agent continued, "I think it's time for you to sit down. If you don't, I'll be forced to involve the authorities and have you escorted off this plane before we even leave the ground." Mr. Thompson's face had turned white, the anger draining from his features. His jaw clenched, and he glanced around the cabin as if hoping someone would come to his defense. But no one did. Not a single person in the area seemed to sympathize with him. Instead, the eyes of the passengers were fixed on him, watching intently, some with curiosity, others with silent approval. The agent didn't take his eyes off Mr. Thompson. "I suggest you listen to what I'm saying. You've caused enough disruption for one day." Mr. Thompson opened his mouth again, but no words came out. It was as though his ability to speak had left him entirely. He looked around, desperate, but when his eyes fell on the agent's badge again, he visibly deflated. His shoulders slumped, and he finally mumbled, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Ava watched all of this unfold, her heart still racing. It felt surreal, like she was witnessing someone else's story rather than living through it herself. The man who had been so angry, so adamant that she didn't belong there, was now apologizing, though not with much conviction. It seemed like he didn't fully grasp the gravity of his actions, but Ava could feel the power of the moment. He had been put in his place, and it was a place where he couldn't escape his behavior anymore. The agent gave a small nod, his expression still unreadable. "Good. Now sit down and remain quiet for the rest of the flight. If I hear another word from you, there will be consequences." Mr. Thompson hesitated, then slowly took a few steps back toward his seat. He didn't say anything more, but Ava could see the shame on his face. It was there, hidden beneath the layers of pride and anger he had been carrying, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that his actions had consequences. As Mr. Thompson sat down, the agent turned toward Ava. Their eyes met, and Ava felt a sudden sense of calm wash over her. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until that moment. She had been bracing herself for something far worse to happen, but now that it was over, she felt a strange kind of relief. The agent offered her a brief but reassuring smile. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but genuine. Ava nodded, though she couldn't quite find the words to express how grateful she felt. "Yes, thank you," she managed to say. "I didn't know what to do." "You didn't have to do anything," the agent replied. "This wasn't your fight to fight. But you stood your ground, and that's what matters. You're safe now." Ava felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It was so rare for someone to acknowledge her strength in a situation like this. Most people just expected her to be quiet, to let things slide when she was treated unfairly. But this man, whoever he was, had seen her as more than just a victim of someone else's prejudice. He had seen her as a person with rights and dignity, and that made all the difference. Sophie, the flight attendant, returned to the scene, her eyes now full of relief. She looked at the agent with gratitude and then turned to Ava, offering her a small nod of approval. "I think we're all good now," she said, her voice lighter. "Thank you," Ava said to Sophie, and then she looked back at the agent. "Thank you so much. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." The agent gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just doing my job," he said. "No one should ever make you feel less than anyone else. Not on this plane, not anywhere." Ava smiled back, feeling a sense of empowerment that she hadn't known she was missing. She had come into this flight with a sense of anticipation for the trip ahead, but now, with everything that had happened, she felt stronger, more confident in herself than ever before. The agent gave a quick nod before turning to head back down the aisle, his steps confident and assured. Ava watched him go, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for his calm and decisive actions. She hadn't expected to be part of a situation like this today, but it had changed her. It had reminded her that no one had the right to treat her as less than she was, and that standing up for yourself wasn't always about confrontation, it was about knowing that you deserve respect, no matter what. As the plane finally began its taxi down the runway, Ava looked out the window. The world outside seemed a little different now, a little brighter, as if she was seeing it through new eyes. She wasn't just flying to see her grandmother anymore, she was flying with a new sense of self-assurance that would stay with her long after she'd landed. The rest of the flight was quiet, almost too quiet. Ava could still feel her heart pounding a little, but it wasn't the same kind of tension as before. The agent's calm intervention had shifted the atmosphere in a way that was both reassuring and empowering. She could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders, and slowly, the anxiety that had been building up in her chest started to fade. Mr. Thompson, the man who had caused all the trouble, didn't make another sound for the rest of the flight. He sat in his seat, his head down, and his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Ava could see that he was still shaken, though he tried to keep his composure. His earlier arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by a kind of sullen silence. Ava couldn't help but notice the way he avoided making eye contact with anyone in the cabin, as if he were ashamed of the scene he had caused. The other passengers seemed to take a collective breath as well, and the quiet hum of the plane filled the cabin once more. It was as though everyone had been holding their breath during the confrontation, waiting to see what would happen next. Now that the tension had dissolved, many of them seemed to settle back into their seats, their attention no longer focused on the drama that had just unfolded. Ava sat back in her seat, feeling a bit more relaxed, though still processing everything that had happened. She glanced around, and for the first time, she noticed the other passengers were looking at her with more than just curiosity. There was something else in their eyes now: respect. She wasn't just the girl who had been harassed by an angry passenger anymore. She was the person who had stood her ground, and that made all the difference. She couldn't help but feel a little proud of herself. She had been terrified at first, unsure of what to do, but she had held her own. It hadn't been easy, but she had faced the situation head-on, and it had turned out better than she could have imagined. She had taken control of a situation that felt completely out of her hands, and in that moment, she had learned something about herself that she would carry with her forever. As the flight continued, Ava found herself thinking about what had happened. She had grown up in a world where she often felt like she had to shrink herself, to make herself smaller in order to fit in. It wasn't just because of her race, but because of the expectations placed on her as a young woman. There were times when she had been told to keep quiet, to not rock the boat, to let things go. But today, she had done the opposite. She had spoken up, and it had made a difference. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the captain's voice coming over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now reaching our cruising altitude. We will be coming around soon to offer drinks and snacks. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of your flight." Ava couldn't help but smile a little. It was a simple announcement, but it marked the end of a chapter of tension and the beginning of something new. The rest of the flight passed smoothly, with nothing out of the ordinary. The flight attendants came around with drinks, and Ava accepted a cup of water, her hands still a little shaky. But now, it was more from the rush of adrenaline than from fear. She glanced over at Mr. Thompson again. He was still sitting in his seat, his eyes glued to the window. He had barely moved since the confrontation, and Ava noticed that the other passengers were giving him a wide berth. He had become a silent figure in the cabin, a reminder of what had happened, but no longer the focal point of anyone's attention. Ava's thoughts wandered back to the agent, the man who had stepped in when things were at their worst. She hadn't had a chance to thank him properly, and she knew she should. But somehow, she couldn't find the right words. What do you say to someone who has just made you feel safe in a world that can sometimes feel hostile? As the plane flew on, she thought about how quickly things could change. Just a short while ago, she had felt so powerless, trapped in a situation that seemed completely out of her control. And yet, with one person's intervention, everything had shifted. She felt a new kind of strength inside her, one that she hadn't known was there before. Eventually, she heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see the agent walking down the aisle again, heading toward the back of the plane. As he passed her seat, he paused for just a moment. Ava looked up at him, and for the first time, she felt like she could actually speak to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." The agent gave her a slight nod, his expression still calm but warm. "It's my job," he said simply. "But I'm glad I was here when you needed help." Ava smiled, the weight of everything still heavy but now accompanied by a sense of peace. "Still, I'm grateful. I don't think I could have handled that on my own." He gave her a small smile in return. "Sometimes, all it takes is standing your ground. You did that today. You were stronger than you knew." With that, he continued on his way, disappearing toward the back of the plane. Ava watched him go, feeling a strange sense of admiration. He wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was someone who had made a real difference, someone who had reminded her that standing up for what's right could change everything. As the flight went on, Ava continued to reflect on the events that had just unfolded. She wasn't sure if she would ever forget the feeling of Mr. Thompson's angry words, the fear in her chest, or the way the agent had stepped in so effortlessly. But what she would remember most was the strength she had found within herself. She hadn't let someone else's prejudice define her. She had fought back, not with anger, but with dignity and courage. When the plane finally began its descent, Ava knew she was ready for whatever came next. The journey had taught her more than just how to handle a difficult situation, it had shown her that she had the power to take control of her own story, to shape her own destiny. And that, more than anything, was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As the plane began its descent, the first hints of the ground becoming visible below, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The flight was almost over. What had started as a stressful and tense journey was coming to an end, but the memories of what had happened would stay with her for a long time. The weight of the experience lingered, but it was a different kind of weight now, one that felt empowering rather than draining. The fasten seat belt sign flickered on, and the plane began its final approach toward the airport. The cabin was filled with soft clicks of seat belts being fastened, and the low hum of the engines was joined by the quiet conversations of passengers who had started to relax again. Ava looked out the window, her mind drifting back to everything that had occurred. She kept replaying the scene in her head, the moment when the agent had stepped in, and everything had shifted. She hadn't been expecting to face such an intense situation, especially not on what was supposed to be a simple flight to see her grandmother. But now, she felt like a different person, someone who had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated and had come out stronger for it. It wasn't just about standing up to Mr. Thompson. It was about finding the courage to face uncomfortable situations head-on and to hold her ground, even when it seemed easier to back down. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and the cabin was filled with the sound of the wheels skimming the runway. Ava's heart gave a little jolt. It felt surreal that the flight was over. As the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers began to gather their things, eager to exit and continue with their day. Ava followed their lead, slowly unbuckling her seatbelt, her mind still processing the events of the flight. When the plane finally came to a full stop, the door opened, and passengers began to shuffle toward the exit. Ava stood up and grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She hesitated for just a moment before stepping into the aisle. It felt like the end of something, but it also felt like the beginning of something else. She didn't know exactly what that something was yet, but she knew it was important. She had learned something new about herself on this flight, something she hadn't realized she needed to learn. She had been afraid to speak up, afraid of rocking the boat, afraid of causing a scene. But now, she understood that standing up for herself wasn't about causing trouble. It was about demanding respect, and that was something she was entitled to. As she walked toward the exit, she caught sight of Mr. Thompson again. He was still sitting in his seat, his hands folded in front of him. He hadn't moved since the confrontation, and he wasn't looking at anyone. Ava's eyes briefly met his, and she saw the shame there, the shame that had replaced his earlier anger. He didn't say anything to her, didn't apologize again, but Ava didn't need him to. She had already won the battle. He had been forced to recognize that he couldn't just push people around because of his own sense of entitlement. Ava walked down the jetway and into the terminal, feeling a rush of fresh air as she stepped outside. The airport was bustling with activity, people coming and going, the familiar sounds of announcements echoing through the halls. She couldn't help but smile as she made her way toward the baggage claim area. The weight in her chest had been replaced with a sense of pride. She had faced something that many people would have avoided, and she had stood tall. She hadn't backed down, even when she was scared. And that, in itself, was a victory. As she waited for her bag, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the message. It was from her grandmother. "Can't wait to see you. I'm so proud of you. Safe travels." Ava smiled and typed a quick response. "I'm almost there. See you soon." For a moment, she just stood there, letting the words sink in. Her grandmother didn't know what had happened on the plane, but Ava knew that this trip, this moment, would mean something more than it had before. She had stood up for herself, and now she could walk into her grandmother's arms with a new sense of strength and confidence. Her bag finally arrived, and she grabbed it from the conveyor belt, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hands. As she made her way out of the terminal, she saw a few familiar faces in the crowd, people who hadn't witnessed the confrontation on the plane, but people who would still see her as the same Ava. But she wasn't the same. She felt different, like she had been given a new perspective on life. She knew she could face challenges now, challenges that might have once felt impossible to handle. She had proven to herself that she could handle more than she ever imagined. Ava stepped outside the airport and into the bright, sunny day. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. It was a new beginning, a chance to move forward with a clearer understanding of herself. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was someone who had faced adversity and had come out stronger for it. The world was full of challenges, but Ava knew she could meet them. She had already started proving that to herself, and she was ready for whatever came next.